Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for being here for tonight's McDougall Lecture Series event. My name is Greg Bowman, and I serve as the Dean of the West Virginia University College of Law. And tonight, we are honored to hear from our McDougall Visiting Scholar for this year, Rachel Wechsler. Before I yield the podium to my colleague, Professor Ann LaFosso, to introduce our speaker, I want to provide you with some background on the Archibald McDougall Lecture Series on International Law. It is an interesting story, and I think we can all learn from this story as well as from what we're about to hear. We have held this lecture series at WVU for nearly 30 years now, and we have had McDougall visiting international faculty visit and teach at the WVU College of Law for years as well. So let's go back 30 years. Back then, it was not common at all to talk about international law or global affairs at most American law schools. We do it regularly now, but not back then. So this lecture series, which was established 3 decades ago, was quite literally ahead of its time. It is part of our long tradition at the WVU College of Law of being committed to addressing issues that are important to the global legal community, and in fact to our local legal community. So we owe a debt, a great debt, to Mr. McDougall for his gift to the College of Law that funds this lecture series. Mr. McDougall's background is fascinating. He was a lawyer. He lived in Berkeley County in the eastern part of West Virginia, and he embodied West Virginia's ties to the wider world outside the nation and the state. But he was not a WVU graduate. He wasn't even originally from West Virginia. He was a true Renaissance man, however. He was born in 1908 in Hobart, Tasmania, a long way away. He earned his bachelor's degree and his law degree from the University of Tasmania. He was a Rhodes Scholar. He was educated at Oxford and Columbia. And for much of his career, he was active in diplomatic affairs. He was a representative to the U.S. Senate's Legislative Counsel's Office. He served as legal advisor to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He was a law professor in Iraq. And he also served as a delegate to the League of Nations, the predecessor to the United Nations. He represented British interests and American interests during World War II, and after the war, he was a legal advisor to the British Embassy in Egypt and the British Foreign Affairs Office. Now, that's all pretty impressive. But in 1952, Archibald McDougall decided to make his big move, and he moved from Washington, D.C. to Berkeley County, West Virginia. He was a well-known attorney in Berkeley County for many, many years. He served as president of the Berkeley County Bar Association. He was a member of the West Virginia State Bar and the American Bar Association. He was admitted to the U.S. Supreme Court and to the Middle Temple Bar, one of England's 4 Inns of Court for barristers. In short, Archibald McDougall lived a full and accomplished life. He passed away in 1984, but he bequeathed money to the College of Law that has established this lecture series. His gift to us ensures that his legacy and his international impact live on through this lecture series. And we're very, very proud to be the home of the Archibald McDougall Lecture Series in International Law. The series helps us at the College of Law demonstrate our firm commitment to international programs and the study of issues that are critically important to the global community. And we should bear in mind at WVU that globalization is one of the 5 key tenets of the university's 2020 Vision Plan. The study of globalization and international law matter, not just to the world, not just to the nation, but to our state. So as an international scholar myself, let me just say that I think that addressing global issues is not just a way to better understand the world, it is a better way to understand ourselves. I think Archibald McDougall, a true internationalist and West Virginian who spent 3 decades here, would agree with me. I think that too often in this state, we don't give ourselves enough credit for what we do right. And I think sometimes we may be reluctant to consider what we might do better. But turning a global comparative mirror upon ourselves is a way to do just that. For me, becoming an international scholar has helped me be a better person, a more compassionate and better lawyer. It's helped make me a prouder citizen of my state and a prouder citizen of my country. So I think we all owe a great debt of gratitude to Archibald McDougall for this lecture series, for a legacy that transcends his lifetime, as well as our state and our national boundaries. So today's lecture by Professor Wechsler is a wonderful addition to this international lecture series, and it epitomizes what Archibald McDougall stood for. So with that, I am pleased to turn the podium over to my colleague, Professor LaFaso, who will introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. That was very interesting, actually. I'm Ann LaFaso. I'm a professor here of labor law and employment law. And many of you may not know this, but Dean Bowman, as he alluded to, he is an international law scholar, international trade in particular, but he was also a McDougall lecturer. He did a McDougall lecture. And it was on Korea, if I remember. It was very interesting. I haven't missed, since I've been here, the McDougall series, and it really is serving its purpose. It's so important. And it's wonderful to see so many students here. I wanted to introduce our guest tonight, Rachel Wechsler. She hails originally from New York. She attended Cornell, where she received her bachelor's in 2004. And she majored in human development and received honors, and she also minored in communications. She then went to Oxford after that to do a master's in evidence-based social intervention. And she received academic distinction for the thesis she wrote. So once again, she showed her academic prowess in a second degree at a very fine institution. She was also an exchange student at the University of Amsterdam, showing again that now she's at least visited 3 different countries and studied at least in 3 different countries at that point. She then went to the University of Pennsylvania, where she received her law degree, and she also received the Wharton Certificate for Business and Public Policy. From there, she spent the first part of 2010 where she clerked for the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, which is a very prestigious clerkship, and I don't know if she's going to talk at all about that, but you should definitely try to talk to her during the reception about her work there. From there, she went to Latham & Watkins, which is one of these big New York firms, and this is where her and my story actually meet, because she was a lawyer there. She was a litigation associate, which is it's very prestigious to be a litigation associate in these big New York firms. But she also wanted to give back, and so she became the head of the firm's pro bono asylum clinic. But there she met my brother, and my brother is a paralegal there. He has a business degree rather than a law degree, and she worked pretty closely with my brother George on several litigation matters. And when she decided to leave Latham, my brother said, you remind me a little bit of my sister. Why don't you talk to her? And I forgot to tell you, she was leaving Latham because she got into the PhD program in the Faculty of Law, specifically criminology she was going to do. And we started to, just a few years ago, we had a correspondence. We had not met until about 3 weeks ago, but we had a correspondence, and based on the incredible work that she's doing, that she's going to tell you all about today in her fascinating research in human trafficking, I recommended her for this prestigious series. I think you're going to be very happy with what you see tonight. She's currently teaching as our McDougall Fellow in international human rights. And I've been auditing the course, and I'll say I've learned a lot. So I really appreciate what you've been doing in that class for our students, but also for me. So with that, would you please give a warm West Virginia welcome to our guest, Rachel Wechsler.
Good evening. Thank you, Professor LaFaso, for your kind words and introduction. She has to run off to teach the Supreme Court clinic, but she promises she'll watch the recording later. Thank you, Dean Bowman, for your introduction as well. And also, I'd just like to extend my thanks to the entire WVU law faculty for the wonderful opportunity to spend 5 weeks here as a McDougall Fellow. I'm very grateful for this opportunity, and I've had an extraordinarily positive experience so far. And I'm happy to see some of my students in the audience today. So, as Professor LaFaso indicated, I am currently doing my PhD at the University of Oxford in criminology, and the focus of my research is on human trafficking. So I thought that would be a good topic to talk about tonight. And I wanted to focus specifically on some background about human trafficking, which I'm sure you've all heard about in the news, media, and just in popular culture. But I'm going to give you some background and talk about risk factors, some responses, both legal and non-legal responses to human trafficking, and also the role of victims in all of this. So just to start, what is human trafficking? Now, that's a good question. It has actually resulted in a large amount of debate. But in the year 2000, the Palermo Protocol was adopted, which is a protocol to the United Nations Treaty on Transnational Organized Crime. And this protocol, after intense debate, settled on the following definition of human trafficking. It is the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of the threat or use of force or other forms of coercion, of abduction, of fraud, of deception, of the abuse of power or of a position of vulnerability, or of the giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person for the purpose of exploitation. So that's a mouthful, and I'm going to break it down for you a little bit. So the definition can be broken down into three components: act, means, and purpose. And for human trafficking to exist, you need at least one from each column of act, means, or purpose. And I would first like to point out what's missing from this definition, which I think is it is commonly assumed that in order for human trafficking to occur, there needs to be some transnational or cross-border component. And that's actually not the case. Human trafficking can occur within a single country. It can occur within a single town. It just has to have the following components of act, means, and purpose in order to constitute human trafficking. And so some of you might be surprised to learn that. I know I was when I first did. But interestingly, even if a victim of human trafficking consents to the exploitation, if one of the means that is listed in the center column, such as threat or use of force, coercion, abduction, fraud, if one of those means is used, then the person's consent is irrelevant for the purposes of determining whether human trafficking has occurred. And also, in the case of a child victim of trafficking, none of the means actually needs to be used in order for it to constitute human trafficking. So for someone who's under 18 years old, as long as there is an act and the purpose components, then that constitutes human trafficking. So what is the nature of the human trafficking problem? You might have read about this in media or seen documentaries, but I'm going to give you some information, some background information about the problem in general. First of all, human trafficking happens everywhere. In virtually all countries around the world, there really is not a single country that is not affected, or a territory that is not affected by human trafficking. And types of exploitation that constitute human trafficking are forced labor, such as forcing someone to work in the manufacturing sector, or forcing someone to work as an au pair or a servant in your house. So there's really a wide range of different sort of actions that can constitute forced labor. Sexual exploitation, which is very often thought of as the first thing people think of when they think about human trafficking. Forced begging, organ removal, child soldiers, and forced marriage. That's not an exhaustive list, but covers many of the main types of human trafficking. Interestingly, there's no reliable global victim or perpetrator estimate of the actors involved in human trafficking because these are considered hidden populations. Even though estimates have been made in the past, they've been really criticized heavily by academics for weak methodologies. And in particular, because of the fact that human trafficking victims and human traffickers are these hidden populations, which basically means that the size and the boundaries of the group cannot be determined. And this is for a variety of reasons. For example, it's difficult to determine exactly how many human traffickers there are because it's a criminal activity. So by its very nature, it's very clandestine, and human traffickers actually go to great efforts not to be caught, not to have their activity detected. Also, human trafficking victims, a large amount of human trafficking victims are undocumented migrants. So therefore, many of them try to keep a low profile, and they're afraid of deportation, afraid of reporting the fact that they have been victimized in this way. Also, in certain cultures in particular, there's a lot of stigma and shame in being a victim of human trafficking, such as if you were forced to work in prostitution, then there can be some cultural concerns that their village or their community is not going to accept them again. So if they try to return and it's found out that they actually were forced to engage in this behavior, so it's another reason why it is so hard to detect who actually is a victim. And finally, countries, in terms of trying to count how many victims of human trafficking, how many traffickers there are in their own country, they have a lot of incentives to underreport. First of all, because it's good PR for a country to say, we actually have a very low amount of human trafficking going on here, and it also makes them look good saying that they're trying to argue that their efforts to fight trafficking are actually really effective. Also, in terms of foreign aid is connected to, in particular, U.S. foreign aid through the Trafficking in Persons report. Certain aid is connected to how well countries are fighting trafficking. So that is an incentive to underreport the problem. So those are just a few of the reasons why it is so difficult to even give an estimate of how many victims of human trafficking there are in the world, or even in a particular country or region, and how many perpetrators of the crime there are. So how does human trafficking occur? Actually, I'm going to go back to this slide and talk about the last point. Human trafficking often intersects with sensitive issues such as prostitution and migration. And there are really intense debates about whether a country's policy, for example, relating to prostitution, leads to either an increase or decrease in the incidence of human trafficking. And actually, the research is very inconclusive about that, but these issues are often connected in practice, but especially in terms of policy debates. And also with migration, a lot of people think about human trafficking and issues, for example, human smuggling in the same breath, even though they are actually distinct phenomena, because human trafficking doesn't require that there be a cross-border element, whereas human smuggling involves illegally crossing borders into another state, and facilitating that is a human smuggler would facilitate that. So these are actually two distinct phenomena, but are often talked about in the same debate, in the same sort of policy realm. So there is intersectionality where, for example, someone who is smuggled into a country can then be trafficked. So human trafficking does intersect with these other issues, which makes it is especially contentious issue, especially when talking about something like prostitution policy or migration policies of different countries. So how does human trafficking occur? And we actually had a little bit of a tech hiccup. I had a video embedded here, and to show you one instance where it is one mechanism by which it is commonly thought that human trafficking occurs. So I'm actually going to just switch to the video now. It was originally embedded, but we have to just work with the technology that we have right now. So you might recognize this clip. Oh, wait. We don't actually have sound at the moment. We have someone to help with tech support.
Yeah, there's sound.
We don't have sound at the moment.
There should be.
Okay, I will just describe what is happening in this video clip, which I'm sure how many of you have seen the movie Taken? See, we don't even need to watch the clip because you have all seen it, even though it would have been, a nice example. But in the movie Taken, for those 2 or 3 people in this room who haven't seen it, there's a girl who goes on vacation with her friend to Paris, and this Albanian gang comes and actually violently kidnaps her and her friend to traffic them for the purposes of sexual exploitation. And so this clip actually shows that the kidnapping, the abduction scene where, she's violently pulled from under the bed and her friend is grabbed by these men. And I just wanted to point out that, while this does happen, this situation is something that happens in the context of trafficking, well, with the exception of Liam Neeson's character. But, it's a very powerful scene. But I actually want to point out that more often than not, there are other mechanisms at play. And let me just go back into this PowerPoint. Okay. So more often than not, that's not the situation or how human trafficking actually occurs in real life. I'm not saying it never happens, but it's less common than some other mechanisms. False job offer. So in this situation, which is fairly common in the context of trafficking, somebody accepts a job offer, typically abroad, to be, for example, a nanny or a waitress or to work in a hotel, and accepts this job offer, and all the details are arranged by this company or this person's contact, but then, in reality, the job offer doesn't turn out to be what is advertised, and this person arrives in the country thinking that they're going to have this one job, and then their passport is taken, they can't go anywhere, and they're forced to do another job, such as prostitution or forced labor in a factory. And so that's actually one of the very common ways that human trafficking occurs. Another mechanism is debt bondage. For example, people can also want to move to another country or another region within the same country for economic reasons, but they don't have the money to actually pay for their travel and everything that needs to be arranged. So they accept a loan and think they have this great economic opportunity in the country to which they're traveling, and think that they'll be able to pay off the loan right away. But these loans often have extremely high interest rates, and it's very difficult to pay it off. So then the person says, well, you owe me this money, so you're going to work for free, and you're going to work under what conditions I say until you pay off your debt. So that's actually a fairly common situation. Another one is called the lover boy phenomenon. And this has been well documented in areas, particularly the Netherlands. And what happens in this situation is that typically a male will, who intends on trafficking a female, will seek out a girl who maybe is particularly vulnerable, who comes from a broken home, who's insecure, has low self-esteem, and then start giving her attention, and starts giving her romantic attention, and actually convinces her that he's in love with her and that he's her boyfriend. And so in this scenario, this girl who typically didn't receive much attention, maybe at home, or had some struggles, is finally, it's like her dream come true. And so she actually falls in love with him. And then he psychologically and emotionally manipulates her, and usually starts out something along the lines of, oh, I really need money and I'm so stressed. The guy will say, I'm so stressed and I owe this money. Can you please help me? Can you please, sleep with somebody so I can get money, and just do it this one time. And so, after he's groomed her and she really loves him and will do anything for him, and, he's psychologically coercing her. And so then she does it one time, and then there might be another time. And, before she knows it, she is actually being forced to engage in prostitution through psychological coercion. And so this is something that in my research, which I conduct in the Netherlands, is extremely prevalent and has been well documented. Another mechanism by which trafficking occurs is utilitarian child selling. And what this entails is, in some very poor countries where families are in desperate poverty and they have many children, and they can't, they might owe a debt and the interest rate is very high, or they can't afford to feed the children that they have, they'll actually make a utilitarian decision after, living in this really desperate situation to, for example, sell one of their children. And maybe they don't know exactly what situation this child's going to be in. Let's say someone says, I'll offer to give your child an education or something like that, and it would relieve the burden on the rest of the family. And sometimes the parents actually know that this child is going to actually be sexually exploited. For example, there was a fairly recent article about this happening where in really poor Cambodian villages, parents would actually sell their daughter's virginity, and the family would be able to stay afloat financially, but this one child would have been sacrificed in order to benefit the rest of the family in these desperate situations. So these are, different mechanisms by which human trafficking happens, which I would argue are more common than someone actually being physically abducted and just yanked. So a little bit more background about who the players are. Who are trafficking victims? And I want you to really keep in mind, what I said about it being a hidden population. So we can't really know the full, true extent of who the victims are and who the perpetrators are, but there have been some estimates that have been made. For example, the United Nations did a very comprehensive global study, and the numbers that they give are conservative numbers, particularly in light of the difficulty to detect the true nature of the problem. So they found that the United Nations Office on Drug and Crime found that the majority of human trafficking victims are female, and this both includes adult women and underage girls. Foreigners in the country in which their exploitation is detected. And typically, the trafficking routes go from poorer countries to more affluent countries when there is a cross-border component. Typically, there are sending nations, which are poorer nations, and people are trafficked from there to more affluent nations, which are often called either destination or receiving nations. And the most common form is sexual exploitation, but just keep in mind that's the most commonly detected form, and there has been a recent trend over the years that more and more other types have been detected, such as forced labor or organ trafficking or forced begging. Originally, maybe 10 years ago, the amount of human trafficking that was in the form of sexual exploitation comprised a much bigger portion of this pie chart. So now they've been successful in detecting other types of exploitation, more and more so. So I have this nifty chart here that just shows a breakdown of the different types of exploitation, and this covers the years 2010 to 2012. So who are the traffickers? So keeping in mind that we're taking all these statistics and generalizations with a grain of salt due to the hidden nature of the population, the majority of detected human traffickers are male. Most of them are citizens of the country in which they were convicted, and that's particularly in sending countries. So overall, in sending countries, those are the poor countries where people usually originate, and when there's a cross-border trafficking, about 95% of the traffickers convicted in those countries are actually nationals of those countries. But that figure actually reduces to 42% if you look at receiving countries. So about 42% of the people convicted of trafficking in receiving countries are citizens of that particular country. So there's been a lot of debate about whether or not human trafficking always involves transnational, or predominantly involves transnational organized criminal groups like the mafia, gangs like that. And so there has really been a back and forth debate because many people have asserted, this really is predominantly a transnational organized crime. But more and more over the years, you see evidence of human trafficking happening on a much smaller scale, where independent individuals are acting, not in collusion with anybody else, but for example, a parent selling her daughter's virginity is only acting independently, selling her daughter's virginity to somebody else in that village. Or in the case of domestic help, just trafficking one or two people in your own house and having them as your slaves, your domestic servants, and not paying them. But you're not working with a large-scale criminal network. But on the other hand, there is strong evidence that human trafficking is one of the main businesses of many transnational organized criminal networks. Importantly, one of the reasons why these networks are interested in this business is because, unlike with arms or with drugs, you can sell people multiple times. They don't get used up. You don't need to produce more. So you can sell a person and keep making a profit from that person over and over again, unlike some other businesses that have traditionally been engaged in by transnational organized criminal groups. So what factors put individuals at risk? And I just want to point out that the factors I'm going to be talking about isn't an exhaustive list of all risk factors of human trafficking, but there are some factors that I'll talk about that happen over and over and over again, and you see them present in many different cases of human trafficking. And so they have really become the focus of a lot of research and examination to try to figure out if there can be any structural changes that can be made to effectively combat human trafficking. Poverty is a major one. Poverty really leads to a sort of desperation and interacts with a lot of the other factors, and you see this over and over again. People are more willing to take a risk and take a job in a country they don't know, or a job where they really don't have many details about exactly what they're going to be doing or the people they're going to be working for, if you're so desperately poor that you can't meet your basic needs or your family's basic needs. Economic inequality. And this has been increasing the impact of this factor has been increasing over the years due to globalization and the advent of new technologies, allowing for communications and allowing for people in more and more countries to see how people in other countries are living and what people in other countries have. So this relates to the idea of relative poverty. So it's not necessarily that you are desperately poor, which is the case in many situations, but it's more of a comparison. If you think that people in another country If you're relatively poor to people in another country, you might be more incentivized to go to that other country and maybe take risks to get those material things that people in this other country have. Also, if your neighbor or other people in your village travel abroad and come back with stories of wealth or come back with material items that nobody else in the village has, you feel relatively poor compared to that person, and might be more willing to take more risks that can make you vulnerable to human trafficking. Lack of options is an important one, and this interacts with poverty as well. If your options are constrained, you actually might make a perfectly rational decision to take a risk and engage in economic migration. You might make a rational decision to do that if you have absolutely no options, such as absolutely no employment options in your own country. So even though you might think this person's crazy, they have no idea who they're going to work for, they have no idea what's going to happen, they don't know the language, they don't know the culture about where they're going to, well, if you look at their actual situation, their current situation, and due to their lack of options, this might actually seem like a desirable choice. So migration, we talked a little bit about human smuggling and how it's distinct from human trafficking. But somebody can actually both be smuggled and trafficked. For example, if they agree to enter a country illegally with the help of a human smuggler, they're under the control of that smuggler to a certain extent, and the person who's being smuggled might not know the language or the area or how to get help once they arrive at their destination, which can leave them vulnerable to being exploited. Gender roles and inequality. Women actually are disproportionately represented among the world's poor, and this is at least in part due to the systematic oppression of women that happens in many parts of the world. Women who are not equals under the law do not have the same access to education and economic opportunities, which may lead them to look elsewhere, and they might be vulnerable to trafficking if they are seeking economic opportunity but also haven't had the benefit of education or support in their own country due to this systemic inequality. Transnational organized crime, which we talked about, human trafficking is a business that is engaged in that transnational organized criminal groups frequently engage in. And if those groups are very powerful in a certain country, then that can make the people who live there much more vulnerable to falling prey to human traffickers. So inadequate legal regimes, certain legal regimes might not have the capacity and the laws might not be in place, which is the case in many countries around the world today, that adequately criminalize human trafficking, provide adequate sentences for people who have trafficked others. And so legislatively, it can give rise to a culture of impunity if there isn't in the domestic legal system laws that prohibit this type of crime. Poor law enforcement. So this relates to the inadequate legal regimes also in the sense that countries can lack capacity. They might not have, especially countries that have been subject to natural disasters or have other internal instability, armed conflict. They might not have, which is the case in many countries, the actual capacity of not have enough law enforcement officers to actually implement any laws against human trafficking or detect human trafficking, and that can put people at risk to exploitation. Also corruption, law enforcement authorities can be paid to look the other way in many countries, and this also fosters that culture of impunity that really leaves people vulnerable. They're not being protected by the authorities in their own country, the government in their own country. So how is this problem being addressed? And in recent years, particularly in the last 15 or so years since the Palermo Protocol was adopted, there has been a greater level of awareness, and different sectors of society have taken concrete steps to try to combat this problem of human trafficking, which has really become an epidemic. So legislative measures is one of the means by which countries, as well as regional systems and globally, steps have been taken to combat human trafficking. Domestically, even if you look to the U.S., for example, we have the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which was passed in the year 2000, the same year as the Palermo Protocol, which provides protection and assistance to victims, as well as strengthening the law just against the crime in general. There's also a particularly interesting domestic law in the state of California, which requires mid-size and large companies to be transparent with their supply chains. And this can combat human trafficking by making it more difficult for people to engage in forced labor. By shining the light on what's actually happening in supply chains, companies can be held more accountable. And there's actually a similar piece of legislation that's currently pending in Congress. Monitoring mechanisms. So once you have the law, we have to make sure it's implemented. And the Trafficking in Persons report, which I mentioned earlier, is actually it's actually conducted by the U.S. Department of State, and it entails examining all of the countries around the world and rating them on a three-tiered system as to how well they're combating the human trafficking problem. And also in Europe, there's an arm of the Council of Europe called Greta, and that also writes country reports and also writes reports about general trends in human trafficking. So they monitor the implementation of human trafficking legislation on the various levels. Policing efforts. Police is extremely important in combating human trafficking because they are often the first line of defense. They're often the ones who have the first contact with the victim in order to get the victim out of the trafficking situation. They often have first contact with victims in airports, for example. And so there has been a huge effort on trying to develop ways in which the police can more effectively combat human trafficking. Well, Interpol, for example, is the international law enforcement agency that has taken steps and has facilitated the domestic law enforcement operations and facilitated information sharing to try to really attack the cases in which human trafficking is transnational. And Europol is similar, but it operates within the EU member states and facilitates the cooperation amongst the various EU member states in terms of fighting human trafficking that happens across Europe. Also, many countries have actually taken steps to provide specialized training for their police forces to try to help them better detect victims of trafficking and also to treat victims as victims and not as criminals themselves, which has often happened in the past when, for example, someone is engaged in prostitution, but they're actually a victim of sex trafficking, but they're in places where prostitution is illegal, they're treated as a criminal. Or in the case of undocumented migrants, if they're victims of human trafficking, that might not be known from the outset, and they can just be treated as, illegal migrants and put into immigration detention. So there has been specialized training and task forces developed in a variety of different countries, such as in the Netherlands, they have a special task force on human trafficking, where it's a specialized unit of the police that deals with this particularly complex issue. So civil society has also played a key role in fighting human trafficking. For example, NGOs have formed to fight the problem of trafficking and develop awareness-raising campaigns to really energize and engage people about this problem. NGOs have also been key in developing preventative measures. For example, an NGO that I've worked with called Not for Sale actually tries to provide economic opportunities for communities that are vulnerable to human trafficking, such as a community in the Peruvian rainforest, by providing them with opportunities to have a stake in and manufacture a product they'll be less likely to take a risk and agree to go with a recruiter for a job abroad if there are economic opportunities within their own communities. Also, NGOs have been key in providing victim services, since human trafficking very often involves intense levels of trauma and violence, and a lack of agency. There tends to be a very long recovery period for victims of trafficking, and NGOs have been really key in providing victim services to help them heal and help them recover. Also, there has really been a focus on prosecutions to hold traffickers accountable for the crime. And so it fights a culture of impunity. This has been really key in the discussion and the debate about what should be done about this trafficking problem. And it's something that is really looked at by the monitoring agencies because it's quantifiable. And so it's often looked as a measure of how effective is this country being in the fight against trafficking. Focusing on prosecutions does protect the would-be victims of the traffickers that are actually incapacitated by being convicted and held in jail or prison. It might holding traffickers accountable and effectively prosecuting the crime might deter would-be traffickers. And like I said, it really is a quantifiable measure that is looked at as a measure of effectiveness and how the country is doing as a whole in this fight against human trafficking. But there really is a risk that we're going to talk about later where victims can actually, be used as prosecutorial tools in this mission to hold all traffickers to account and effectively prosecute. It could come at a price, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. So the private sector, businesses have actually also played a key role in fighting human trafficking. One way they've done this is voluntarily increasing transparency in their supply chains. And various companies have done this completely voluntarily to, it's good PR for them, but also it's nice to believe that they actually want to take steps to combat forced labor in their supply chains. For example, Kmart recently made a list of its direct suppliers available. Adidas did the same, and importantly with Adidas, they also, not only their direct suppliers, but they published a list of the subcontractors as well. And this gesture to try to say, this is exactly where, we know exactly how our products are made, and we know the conditions. Like, for example, Adidas also published information about whether collective bargaining agreements and trade unions were in place in the factories in which their products are produced. And so by doing so, it can combat the conditions of that foster forced labor, which basically, if it's not known where the factories are, where the locations are, the conditions, it leaves the workers much more vulnerable to being exploited. Also, partnering with NGOs, a number of companies have done this. For example, the clothing company All Saints has partnered with Not for Sale to produce a line of ethically made clothing, and all of the profits from that clothing go back to Not for Sale to help them with their campaigns and activities that fight human trafficking. So that not only raises awareness, but it also increases, the viability of Not for Sale's operations on the ground and ability to help more and more victims by basically raising money. So the private sector has actually taken a number of steps that have helped to combat human trafficking. Research is another important area. Human trafficking, especially over the last 15 or so years, has become more and more so become a focus of academics and also governmental research. And the question really was, how is this operating? We have to understand the problem before we can effectively combat it. So different things that have been looked into are the extent of the trafficking problem, different trafficking routes, common trafficking routes and flows of people, especially when it involves cross-border trafficking, the demographics, who is being trafficked, who are the perpetrators, different risk factors such as those that we talked about, and also victims' experiences, which is actually the focus of my research. And I'm going to talk briefly about my research now that I've given you some background. So my specific research questions are, how does the criminal justice system engage with victims of sex trafficking? And are there ways in which the criminal justice system can better meet the needs of sex trafficking victims? So, as I said, I'm conducting my research in the Netherlands, which is an interesting setting for several reasons. One, it's a top destination country for human trafficking. Two, it's also been the center of the trafficking debate, particularly in the way that trafficking intersects with prostitution policy in some cases. There has been a lot of criticism since the Netherlands legalized prostitution in the year 2000. Many people have argued that this actually increases the incidence of trafficking. Others have argued that it actually helps to fight trafficking because victims who are forced to engage in prostitution aren't afraid to be open and seek help for fear of being arrested on prostitution charges. So that debate has not been conclusively settled, but it has made the Netherlands really a center for discussion about the human trafficking epidemic. Also, there's a really tight-knit community of service providers for victims in Amsterdam. And due to my work with Not for Sale, I was actually part of the pro bono team that represented Not for Sale while I was an attorney in New York. I was actually able to gain access to this really tight-knit community of people engaging in the anti-trafficking efforts in Amsterdam. So fortunately, I was able to gain access and have conducted my research mainly in a government-run shelter for trafficking victims in Amsterdam, shelter-affiliated housing, that's semi-independent housing, where the victims who live there are still receiving services from the shelter, and Not for Sale, which has an active branch in Amsterdam. I've also conducted research in their headquarters. So my methodology, I'm using qualitative methods as opposed to quantitative methods. So just to distinguish, quantitative methods focus on more numbers and statistical analysis, and I'm actually doing interviews and ethnography and analyzing trends. So I've done interviews. I actually just finished the interviews before I came to Morgantown. I did interviews with 39 victims of sex trafficking. And I also conducted ethnography while I was in Amsterdam. I spent an enormous amount of time in this government-run shelter, and so I really engaged in participant observation and kept a very detailed fieldwork diary just about the interactions and experiences of trafficking victims there. I'm also developed a questionnaire. In the Netherlands, trafficking victims, the vast majority of them are entitled to free legal representation, and many of the lawyers that represent them actually specialize in this area. So I developed a questionnaire specifically for these attorneys who work on trafficking cases to try to figure out what do they think about the system and how it meets the needs of the victims, and how does criminal justice response treat victims of trafficking. Why am I conducting this research? First of all, there's a lack of empirical studies that draw on interviews with trafficked women. So there's this significant gap in the literature that needs to be addressed. And I think it's important for this population to be given a voice. And arguably, the best source of information about the needs of trafficked women are the women themselves. There has been a fair amount of research done with service providers, but not actually with the victims themselves. And so I would like to address this gap in the research. Also, as you probably could guess, victim testimony is often essential to successful prosecutions. In the vast majority of cases, in order to get a conviction for human trafficking, victim testimony has to be a part of the case against the trafficker. And if victims feel like they're better supported and that their needs are better met, they might be more comfortable with assisting with the investigation and the prosecutions. But as I mentioned earlier, there is a problem of victims being used as prosecutorial tools whereby they're supported and given services as long as they're useful to the prosecution. But then as soon as a case closes, for example, they're just tossed aside and they're no longer given access to the support they so desperately need. And so this is an issue that I really want to highlight and examine more through my research. I'd like to draw attention to victims' rights. I'm not looking to compromise the goal of effective prosecutions, but I would like to raise the priority that is generally given to the rights of victims of human trafficking. Also, the Netherlands and other states who are generally destination countries are subject to a variety of international and regional legal obligations, and part of those obligations concerns their treatment of victims and the support and services and assistance that they give to victims. And in order for them to effectively meet these obligations, they need to actually know what the needs of victims are and whether the current system is working and what's working about it, what needs to be improved, and where can we go from here. So I'm actually, like I said, I just returned from my fieldwork before I came to Morgantown. But I have some preliminary observations that I'd like to share with you. I still have a lot of data analysis to do, which I'm looking forward to. But preliminarily, there are a few things that stood out to me. One is that there is a need for greater customizability within the system. The way victims are treated tends to be a one-size-fits-all approach, a blanket approach, whereas their needs can vary depending on what their particular vulnerabilities are, their particular trafficking experiences, the type of trafficking they were exposed to. And so I believe that it is possible and would be beneficial if the system was better tailored to the needs of individual victims. One thing I noticed, this is a common theme I noticed, that agency is of paramount importance to victims. When they're in their trafficking situations, they often lack control and lack agency over their lives, have no control, cannot make any decisions in their own lives. And then once they are taken out of their trafficking situations, there seems to be a tendency that they are infantilized or decisions are made for them about what's best for them once they're out of the trafficking situation and they're receiving services and treatment and counseling. And I've heard from many of the victims that they would like to have more agency and more control over their own lives, make decisions that affect their future and the types of services that they would receive. I've noticed there also really needs to be better communication between the staff in the shelter where I was, and it was quite a large shelter. There were typically between 30 and 50 trafficking victims staying there at any given time. And I noticed that there tended to be a lot of miscommunications between the victims who were staying there and the shelter staff. They seemed to be talking past each other, and that kind of led to some resentment on both sides. And I think that the victims can be better helped if more of an emphasis is placed on communicating with them, involving them, talking to them about decisions that will affect their lives, and checking in with them frequently to make sure you're on the same page. I also noticed that there seems to be a really good working relationship between the staff at the shelter and the police in Amsterdam. And this has been built up over the years. The shelters actually only existed for the past 9 years. And at first there was a bit of skepticism between the two groups, but now it seems pretty seamless, whereas the police will automatically know that if they remove someone from a human trafficking situation, they bring them right to the shelter, and they'll often come and interview them about what happened at the shelter, and there seems to be very open lines of communication between the shelter staff and the police, which can be helpful in terms of meeting victims' needs, because if they're communicated to one party, then hopefully that party will pass the information to the other party. And lastly, one thing that I noticed from interviewing the victims and observing the victims is that they would probably be more willing to assist with prosecutions if authorities did more to ensure their safety. A lot of them are extremely concerned about their safety. And even though they're in the context of a shelter or shelter-affiliated housing, they still have genuine and legitimate concerns about their safety. For one thing, it's very easy to find the shelter address on the internet. Another thing is there's a pretty casual approach for the people, among the people who man the front reception area in terms of letting people in. And also, none of the victims that I spoke to were offered access to a witness protection program, regardless of who their traffickers were, whether their traffickers were part of a very powerful criminal network. None of that mattered. Not a single one was offered access to a witness protection program, for example, assistance in changing their identity or relocation for them and their families. And this was a serious concern on the part of a lot of the victims, and I think it is critical to examine this further in order to effectively meet victims' needs. And so those are some preliminary observations, and I look forward to analyzing the data in more depth in the coming months. And, I'm very excited about where my research has taken me. And I also look forward to sharing my results with the relevant bodies such as police, government, NGOs, to hopefully make a difference on the ground and inform anti-trafficking policy and the victim services that are offered. So are there any questions? I appreciate the time you took to listen to me, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
We have a microphone for questions if anybody would like to ask questions.
Don't be shy. I know I've given you a lot of information to mull over.
You've indicated some problems with the quality of the data. Is there anything in your research that would suggest a methodology that's better at figuring out what the scope of this problem is?
Well, in terms of, it's a question that I've thought about a lot. I think, not in my particular research for my dissertation, I don't think we'll address that particular question, but one thought I've had was trying to incentivize countries to keep better track and not downplay the problem in their own territory, to try to sever the connection between, for example, whether the number of victims is increasing or decreasing, and potential future aid or sanctions, to try to put a system in place where countries are actually motivated to collect accurate data, and also if they don't have the capacity to collect accurate data, then to provide support in that area, whether it's from other countries or an international organization. I'm not sure what the best way to go is. But yeah, to motivate countries to collect better data in their own territories, I see as a way to obtain a better estimate of the extent of the problem. Thank you for your question.
Thanks very much. That was really interesting. You talked about the vulnerable populations and how, which makes a lot of sense that this would be where the people who would be targeted. I'm curious if you talked about the lawyers, for example, that work with them, or the police and other, and the shelters, for example. Sometimes vulnerable populations are victims again going through those systems. And I'm curious if you saw any of that either through the attorneys who work with them, the shelters, or the police, of kind of a repeat problem of the vulnerable being abused again.
Yes, unfortunately I have seen that. They're not abused in the same way again, but they can be re-victimized in the sense of, for example, having to talk about these horrible things that have happened to them over and over again to different parties instead of just having it done once, or to try to minimize the amount of interviews about it. Also, in terms of safety, I know of a particular victim who her safety was at risk at the shelter where I was doing my research, and they moved her to another shelter, but they didn't follow up at all. And in this other shelter, this safe house, it was just her and a couple of other people, and there was no security there, and some of the other people there were bringing over dangerous individuals. And so there just wasn't the continuity of care and follow-up and checks and balances. So I think that there were definitely holes that allow for this re-victimization to happen. So unfortunately, that is a reality. Thanks. Any other questions?
Well, let's give Rachel another big round of applause.
Thank you.
It's a really important, more than a little disturbing topic that is a worldwide problem, including in the United States. So, thank you very much. That was very informative, very enlightening, very important. This concludes the lecture. We now have a reception outside. It wouldn't be WVU College of Law without food. So we have a nice reception outside. Please join us and visit with Rachel Wechsler. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I decided to just